Welcome to the Outer Realms with Michelle LaRoche and Amelia Pisano. Airing live on the United Public Radio Network, 105.3 FM in New Orleans.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Outer Realm Radio with myself, Michelle Roche. Well, tonight it is just me, actually. I don't have my bubbly little companion. We are doing a pre-record, and it's going to be super informative, and I hope you guys are all going to settle in. But before that, we have to go through the technicalities. So we're broadcasting right here on United Public Radio Network, UFO Paranormal Radio Network, 105.3 and 107.7 FM from the beautiful city of New Orleans. We're fully sponsored by the amazing people over at Folgers Coffee, who have been a part of our journey since the very beginning. So thank you, Folgers. It wouldn't be the same without you. Also, truly grateful to Justin Snicker, Dr. Snick, the sonic surgeon, for the contribution of his time, his music, and his voice for the intro that you just heard. He's an award-winning composer of Halloween horror, sci-fi, and dark wave electronic music, whose music can be found on any of your favorite streaming music platforms. So thank you to him. Also, thank you to Steve McGinnis, the artist behind our banners and logos here at the show. Check him out on Facebook and Instagram. Also specializes in the horror genre, but does some amazing commission pieces. So check him out. Tonight, we welcome back. I have to say back. They're here together tonight, but they have both been on the show independently. Philip Mantle and Irena McCammon-Scott, doctor. And they're going to be discussing their new book, which we have actually been waiting for. I think we both even mentioned this book when they were on separately, which is Beyond Reasonable Doubt, Pascagoula Alien Abduction. And a lot of you guys, it's amazing to me that there's so many people that really don't know a whole lot about this, and they should, because this was pretty groundbreaking, especially on this side of the world. Everybody always focuses on, Area 51 and Roswell, and there's a lot of other phenomenal cases out there that are really properly documented, and this is one of them. So without further ado, Philip and Irena, hello.
Yes. Good evening.
How are you?
Fine, thank you.
It is evening for you.
Yes.
You're 5 hours. So Philip is in UK, for those who have no idea. Irena, how are you?
Okay.
I'm glad to hear that. So we were talking a little bit earlier about, and you've just heard me go over very quickly in the intro, how many people really have little idea. I mean, I think the UFO people involved in the field really have an understanding of it to a degree, but I think there's a lot of other people out there who really don't know much about Pascagoula. So why don't we start there? Why don't you guys just bring us in and let's get into the backstory and then get into your book?
Yeah, I mean, we'll go back to 2017, really. And at that point, I obtained the rights to republish UFO Contact at Pascagoula by the late Charles Hickson and William Mendez. That came out in 1983.
Wow.
And I was simply looking to see if I could contact Calvin Parker. I assumed he was still alive, but wasn't positive, just to get an interview with him. And to say that the case had fallen by the wayside is a bit of an understatement. I asked some UFO researchers in Mississippi, for example, where this event happened, and they had no idea what I was talking about. They just did a Google search and sent me some links. Well, I can do that myself. I didn't want any links. I was looking for Calvin's phone or email. Eventually got it, and when I first contacted Calvin, he was very polite, very nice, but not saying an awful lot.
Mhm.
And over the course of a few weeks and a few more phone calls, we came to an agreement to write his book. But the case, really was forgotten. For those that are not aware of the case, it happened on October the 11th, 1973, on the Pascagoula River in Mississippi. Calvin was 18, almost 19. Just got engaged to his childhood sweetheart, Waynette. And they lived in, I think it's somewhere near Laurel, a good couple of 100 miles away. And Calvin was working like 3 jobs a day. He never saw her. And he wanted to settle down. He wanted to plan his life, get married, have a regular job, buy a house, have children, grandchildren, and sail off into the sunset. That was his.
Right.
Now,
Right.
Calvin's family had grown up alongside Charlie Hickson's family. So he knew Charlie. He was good friends with his son, Eddie. So Calvin's father said, why don't you ask Charlie if he can get you a job in the shipyard? You'll work regular hours, So he did, because Charlie was a foreman. He could do the hiring. He got him a job. So the idea was Calvin would live with Charlie Monday to Friday, pay him board and lodgings, and then go home on a weekend. Great. He bought a new car. He was starting a new life. His actual first day at work in the shipyard was October the 11th, 1973. Worked hard all day. He's driving them home at night. Charlie said, do you fancy doing a spot of fishing? I mean, both guys love their fishing. So Calvin said, yeah, can't resist that. So they got some fishing tackle. They stopped off to buy some bait and headed for the river. Now, Calvin didn't know where he was going, so Charlie directed him. And this is not an out-of-the-way place, Michelle. It's right next to Highway 90. There's the bridge goes over the river. And as they're driving up to this spot, they pass a no-entry sign. And Calvin wasn't happy about that, but Charlie said, it's okay. Don't worry about it. So they set up in one spot, which was infected by insects, so they moved. And there was an old pier that belonged to an old shipyard that had long since closed. They perched themselves on there, started fishing. Calvin's watching the world go by. And then they had a little bit of a buzzing noise to begin with. And then this blue light came from behind them and lit up the water in front of them. Calvin's immediate reaction was, it's the police. We're going to get arrested for trespassing. I knew we shouldn't have ignored that no entry sign. And both men sort of simultaneously turned round. And of course, it wasn't the police. There was this oval object descending. It stopped about 2 feet above the ground, give off this intense blue light. There was 2 lights at one end. An opening appeared at the other end, literally just appeared. These 3 very bizarre humanoid creatures, again, floated across towards them. They didn't walk. 2 got hold of Calvin. 1 got hold of Charlie. I'm cutting a long story short here. But they were both taken into this thing and separated. Calvin went left. Glass table or bed of some description. This creature, which they later described as having no neck, big head, protrusions out of the front and the side, long arms with mitten or pincer-like appendages. The legs stayed together all the time. They didn't move, so the legs didn't walk. And their skin, in inverted commas, was dark grey and wrinkled. They likened it to elephant skin. And this creature stood in the corner, and Calvin said he felt this essence of a woman approaching, a female, this presence, if you like. And sure enough, this other being appeared looking almost human. Apart from her middle finger was very long. And she put this down Calvin's throat and up into his navel cavity, which hurt him. One part that he really doesn't like talking about is they removed his lower clothing and his shoes and socks. And they stuck something in his foot. And he said it hurt.
Yeah.
And Calvin's totally paralyzed. He can only move his eyes. His clothing, he got up and he was allowed to put his clothing back on. And he made a grab for this woman, and, she pointed to the creature stood in the corner, which Calvin in later years called it the big ugly thing, And the next thing he remembers, he's back out on the pier, and Charlie's shouting at him, "Are you okay, son? Are you all right, son? Are you all right?" And a similar thing had happened to Charlie. I've missed a few things out there because I'm trying to condense things. They discussed what was the best course of action, and Calvin was adamant, "We're not going to tell anybody. They'll think we're nuts." One of the things he was worried about, of course, was his future father-in-law. He thought, if this gets out, he won't allow me to marry my fiance. Why not?
Different times, right?
Yeah,
Different
absolutely.
times.
Absolutely.
Yeah, right.
So they get back to the car. Bearing in mind the car was brand new, and the passenger window was shattered. It just fell out. The car would not start. I think Calvin estimated it took him about 20 times to start it before it eventually fired, and off they went. As they're heading back home, Charlie had a change of heart. Now, we better tell somebody. What if these things come back and do this to somebody else? What if it's an attack or an invasion? I mean, that's the way he thought. So they pulled in at a store that had a telephone, a public telephone. They rang first Keesler Air Force Base, which is nearby. And then he said, "Sorry, we're not in the UFO business anymore. Ring your local authorities." So they did. They rang the police, and they sent a car out and escorted them into town. They were then at the Sheriff's Department, Jackson County Sheriff's Department, with Sheriff Fred Diamond, and Deputy Glenn Ryder, who interviewed them separately. And quite frankly, didn't believe a word of it, and they told me, "If you're telling us lies, you're in a heap of trouble, They then put both gentlemen in a room together, and there was a desk next to them, and they left them on their own. And the deputy came back a number of minutes later, opened the drawer, took something out of it. Calvin and Charlie had no idea, but it was actually a secret tape recording. They'd been recording them. And they thought, "We'll have them now, hey, presto." But of course, they played the tape back, and they were still talking about what happened to them. I mean, Calvin is literally crawling up the walls. So, they decided to let both gentlemen go. They assured them that they wouldn't tell the news media or anybody. So the next morning, both guys get up, go to work, and they notice there's a few more cars there than normal. And they're summoned to the boss's office. And he said, "What the hell's been going on? The phones won't stop ringing. We can't get any work done." So they tell him about the incident the night before. The news had got out, and to this day, Calvin has no idea how the news leaked out.
Wow.
That's
interesting.
Yeah, at some point they went to the Singing River Hospital for a checkup. They were all fine. And then somebody said, "Well, maybe we should take you to Keesler Air Force Base to test you for radiation." Bearing in mind, they'd phoned Keesler. So they did. They went to Keesler Air Force Base. They ran a Geiger counter over them. There was no sign of radiation. But they did say, "Well, gentlemen, while you're here, why not tell us what happened?" So they obliged. And what is interesting, Michelle, is we actually have a transcript of that conversation at Keesler Air Force Base with all
that's impressive that you actually got that.
With everybody who was there named, because they had a stenographer. And we also have a copy of the transcript of what became known as the secret tape done in the sheriff's office. And of course, the story then took off. 2 days later, Dr. J. Allen Hynek emerged, and Dr. James Harder. And eventually, Charlie went on to promote the story. He was quite happy dealing with it in the media. Calvin retreated back home, ended up in hospital, and then did get married as planned. Not many people know this because we haven't really discussed it, but he then joined the United States Marine Corps. to get away from it all. He thought, if I'm in the Marines, nobody can find me. You know, he was still hounded by the media.
Right.
And that's where the story started, died. You know, nobody knew. You know, Charlie would crop up on a TV show every now and again, or a UFO conference, or a newspaper. But Calvin had disappeared into the Netherlands.
Right.
And that's where it was when we first made contact with them.
Right. So, Irena, how, what brought you into the fold with all of this?
Well, I had worked on something related to that happened at the same time, way back in the 1980s. And there was a strange noise that went across about half the United States that nobody could explain.
Right.
And it happened the same time as the Pascagoula abduction. At the time, I paid no attention to the Pascagoula abduction. I mean, I hadn't interest at all, but I was interested in the sound. And seismologist, the state of Ohio seismologist, worked with me, and we did a lot of exploring on that, and nobody could explain the sound. But it was interesting because I published in a scientific journal, and that the sound was the same time. So then many, many years later, I was working, Philip had published one of my books, and he was getting interested in Calvin, and he wanted somebody to interview people. And so he asked me to, and I was happy to, because I was interested on account of this thing way back.
Right.
Due to two coincidences, there I was.
Right. So this, I guess, became the onset for the book, right? So I'm going to put this up for everybody to see. 1 second, and then we can go. There we go. I'm very excited about it. I love the cover. Bam.
Yeah,
there we go.
Yeah, well, the incident that Irene is referring to there, of course, we've called it a sonic boom. That when, halfway across the United States on the same night as the Pascagoula abduction, the 11th of October, 1973, whether it's a connection or not, we leave the readers to draw their own conclusions. But it's one of those things that happened around this case. Whether it's connected or not, we can't positively sure, but it's just another little bizarre quirk to it. Now, when I contacted Calvin and he decided to write his own book, one of the things I asked him was, do you have any photographs, documents, anything? And he said, no, they all got washed away in Hurricane Katrina. So, and from reading Charlie Hickson's book and republishing it, we knew, because in that book there are one or two witnesses that stepped forward at the time back in 1973. So we thought we might speak to one or two people. So anyway, we set off on a hunt for any documentation, and this is an interesting thread. Charlie, when this incident happened, said what the creatures got hold of him, and he felt a prick in his forearm, and it hurt. Calvin said when he was on board this thing and they removed his shoes and socks, they stuck something in his foot underneath and it hurt. Just bear that in mind for 1 second. So I literally pestered anybody and everybody I could think of. One of my first contacts was the Center for UFO Studies, set up by Alan Hynek. Hynek was on site, within 2 days of the incident happening. They sent me a PDF file that was mostly newspaper cuttings, but they were useful.
Yeah.
But in the middle of all this is a 1-page typewritten document. So it's done on an old typewriter. And you can tell that because it's dated October the 12th, /13th. They've typed over the number.
Right.
And it's got the heading puncture wounds. And it describes a physical examination of Charlie and Calvin. They're stripped down to their underwear and they're given the once over to see if they have any injuries. And it remarks that Charlie Hickson has marks on his forearm, inner forearm, and Calvin Parker, on his foot underneath. And then it mentions there's some photographs. But nowhere else in this file were any photographs. But this document in itself was fascinating.
Right.
I asked Calvin, who wrote this? Who gave you the examination? And he said it was Dr. James Harder. Harder wasn't a medical doctor. I think it was a doctor of engineering. But no photographs. So, we carried on. I think it was a couple of years later, the gentleman from the Center for UFO Studies who'd sent me this file sent me an email. Said, Philip, I've been going through some old files today. I wasn't looking for these, but I assume you've got them anyway, but I thought I'd better send them to you just in case. Boom. These were the photographs that went with that document. And you have you have scans of them back and front. So when it's somebody's arm you're looking at, his name is on the back. That was Charlie Hickson's. And lo and behold, there's these marks on his inner forearm. And there's photographs of the marks on Calvin Parker's foot underneath.
Wow.
So we have the two gentlemen back in 1973 saying we felt these minor injuries, very minor. We then have a document that's written 2 days after the event describing a visual examination and these injuries. And then we have the photographs to accompany them. Now, if you separate them three items on their own, that they're not great. But when you put all three of them together, in my humble opinion, it's a compelling argument that there was a physical interaction with something that night that left minor injuries on these two gentlemen. So that was one of the things that we uncovered. One of the ways I got Irena involved is because people were stepping forward, or I'd find information about people that were still alive. And yes, I could phone them and record them from here in the UK, but they have this strange sounding Yorkshireman across the Atlantic who on a couple of occasions rang people and it was the wrong time because I couldn't get the time difference right. So I needed an ally across the Atlantic, and, fortunately or unfortunately, I asked Irene, and it just depends which way you look at it. But what happened, Michelle, the way it really took off was Calvin did an interview with the local media. And not only did they write a piece, they filmed a little mini doc, 8-minute. And this thing eventually ended up, I think it was on YouTube.
Wow.
And I'm reading the comments underneath it, like, and there's a comment and it said, my mum and dad were on the opposite side of the river that night, and they too saw the UFO. That grabbed my attention.
Right.
Luckily, she wasn't using a silly made-up name. She got her own name. I then found her on Facebook and contacted her, explained who we were and what we'd like to do. And I said, I'd like to speak to your mum and dad. Can you ask them if they'll speak to us? She came back and said, yes, they will. They were Mr. and Mrs. Blair, Jerry and Maria, got their phone number, phoned them and spoke to them. And there was clearly more to it than just being on the other side of the river and seeing the UFO. So I needed someone to be my ally across the pond. And it was Dr. Scott. It was Irena. And I did speak to both Maria and Jerry, but Irena had more to do with Maria than I did. She did most of the interaction and the interview. So I let Irena tell the story about Maria and Jerry Blair.
Yes, please. Were you well received? When you went in for this interview, or did you find that they were reluctant to speak? Because even though they agree, I find that people get hesitant depending on their experience as to how much they want to discuss.
Well, he was talking about the language, and like in the United States, there's language differences too. And they were down south in Mississippi, and I was in Ohio, And my
Yes.
husband was from Mississippi, and we'd go visit, and he'd have to translate for me. But I got used to the accent. And Marie was the very first person I interviewed
Mm.
on this, and so I didn't know too much about it either. In fact, when I started, I hadn't even read about the abduction, so I don't think I, said anything that would have, influenced anybody. But she told me that she and her husband was going out on a boat, ship with his supervisor to work and supply. I think they supplied oil rigs or something like that. And this was before cell phones. It was 1973. And his supervisor was held up some way. And so they were sitting above a pier, which happened to be across the river from Calvin and Charlie. And they saw things going on there, but they didn't know what was happening at that time. And so her husband went to sleep, and she was sitting there in the car, and she saw this thing that she thought was an airplane flying around, and she kept saying she thought the pilot was lost, that it just kept flying around and not going anywhere. And so then her husband said that decided to take his clothes down to the boat. I think it was around 8 or something. They didn't have watches new to Calvin and Charlie. The only thing I know for sure was when the sound was. But so he was walking down the pier in front of her, and what she told me first of all was that something that looked like a man flopped up on the pier right in front of her, and then went back down. And it must have appeared like it didn't have, snorkel or anything. And so she thought it should come back up for air, but she couldn't see anything. And so her husband they said something about a big splash at the end of the pier. Both of them did. I talked to him first, and he just talked real short, and he was a debunker at that time. And he just said something about a blimp and a big splash. And so anyway, she had that happen. And then they walked on down and got in the boat. And what was funny was she came back, but it seemed to be 12 o'clock, which would be quite I wondered what on earth they were doing in the boat for like 3 hours. And so she came back, and she was terrified, and she ran back to her car. And she was very, very emotional about this thing that flopped up on the thing. And I asked her, "Is this a fish?" And she said, "No." "Is it a dolphin?" "No." It looked like a person. And so we never got any place. And I called her. We talked to each other a number of times and wrote quite a bit. And because she was so emotional, I couldn't figure out why she was so emotional about it, although, it'd be scary.
Yes.
And then much, much later, unfortunately, her husband became ill. And he'd been a skeptic the whole time. He told her, "Don't talk about it. UFOs don't exist," and all that. And he became ill. And at that time, I guess they figured he was going to die. Well, he told her that they had been abducted. And this was
Wow. Surprise. Yeah. Wow.
And he had kept it from her all this time. And he told her right before they put the tracheal tube in, and when the ventilator, I guess it was, whatever you call it, and he couldn't talk after that, so she had to guess what he was saying. But they called Philip, and he talked to him and said that too. And so he consciously remembered, he said, being abducted and things, but he'd never wanted to talk about it. And so he never talked to her about it. And so anyway, things went on from there.
Yeah, I mean, I spoke, when I first spoke to Maria, she told me the story as related by Irena there about seeing this. She called it then the grey man in the water, and she called it the grey man. They were her words. And she said to me, I often wondered, she said, if something similar hadn't happened to us that happened to Charlie and Calvin.
Mm-hmm.
She said, I can recollect seeing something out of my peripheral vision, almost as if I've got my eyes almost closed, but she couldn't quite make it out. And as Irena said, on one occasion, Mr. Blair was having an operation to have a pacemaker fitted. And because he was so ill, they weren't sure if he'd even survived the operation. So he was literally sat on his hospital bed with stickers hanging off him. And Maria insisted that he tell me what was going on, and she filmed it. And he said, I saw the lights, on the creatures and so on. He did survive that operation, but, I think it was about a year later, maybe, or 6 months, he eventually passed away. Mm-hmm. So you could look upon what he was telling us as almost like a deathbed confession, if you like.
Yes.
And even though he was ill, Maria was as mad as hell at him for not telling her, because she got brief glimpses of something else happening. But of course, don't tell anything. That also, I think, seeing Charlie and Calvin ridiculed in the media and things of that nature.
Again, sign of the times. And I think people in the South, especially at the time, and I mean, I'm sure in many parts of it still, they're very God-fearing people. So to try to separate that, experience from their belief system must have been very difficult.
Yeah, well, sadly, Jerry passed away not before telling his story, and he literally tried to tell it right to his dying breath. As Irena pointed out, he was on a ventilator, or it was hard for him to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And then just last year, we had the opportunity, if you like. Maria had mentioned this at some point. She thought about hypnotic regression, and it's a contentious part of the UFO field. Some say it works, some say it doesn't. Mm-hmm. I put her off to begin with because I thought she's still getting over her husband's bereavement. But eventually, we hired a local hypnotherapist, professional,
mm-hmm.
A lady by the name of Crystal Slaughter. She had no interest in this subject whatsoever.
Right.
And we conducted the hypnosis at Calvin Parker's home, because Calvin had had hypnotic regression before, and she'd met Calvin and they become friends. So she was among friends, and she was among somebody else who knew what to do. And she went under hypnosis, and we didn't tell the hypnotherapist anything apart from the date, the time, and the location. That was it.
Mm.
And again, whether you believe in regression or not,
at some it works amazing, like you say.
Yeah.
For some people,
Maria was very emotional at times. She was crying.
Yes.
But she slowly but surely revealed this story under hypnosis. She claimed that these creatures had taken her eggs and her DNA, and that the reason they were doing that was to produce babies.
Of course.
Babies that looked just like us, so they could live among us.
Yes.
And she was crying at times. She was very emotional. And there's a long story to it, but she came out with the abduction scenario. And she's repeated that in a recent interview on TV to some respect. They could only show little clips of it, but she's convinced that this did happen. She claims to have seen a few UFO sightings since then.
Do you think she's a repeat? Like, do you think that Calvin and Maria are still being...
We don't know. I mean, right. Calvin did have another encounter in 1996.
Right.
Which we've documented, although it's not in this book. This book is purely about the events in 1973.
Yes.
The only people that Maria and Jerry, her husband, had told were their two daughters. And of course, it was one of their daughters that made that comment on YouTube.
Right.
So
Thankfully.
people were criticizing this, saying, oh, they've stepped forward to get their 15 minutes of fame. Well, they didn't step forward. It was just a small comment made by their daughter that I happened to notice.
Right.
And, we've been in regular contact then. And that's just one aspect of how the story around this encounter started to grow. You know, this all happened over a period of a few years. This part of the story progressing, but there was a time Calvin did mainly local news media, although he did a couple of national TV spots, and a couple abroad, and a few UFO conferences. But I'll give you another example. One of the criticisms was that there is this big road bridge goes right over the river. At the time, back in 1973, nobody stepped forward, said I was driving over the bridge, and I saw this. But you know, they did. And a gentleman called Charles Rusty Anderson contacted us. And he said he was driving over the bridge that night, him and his wife, although his wife was on the opposite side, she couldn't see. And he said down below him, there was this whitish blue thing flying around. And he said it was so low, he thought it was going to crash. You know, and of course, from that vantage point, that's roughly where Charlie and Calvin were. And he said, I only viewed it for 30 seconds. Well, 30 seconds, you know, is quite a while to view certain things, you know?
Absolutely.
And I think it was the next day or the day after he had a relative, I think an aunt down by the river, and he went to see her, and she said, you never guess what I saw the other night. You know, what is interesting, and this will show you how people don't spread these stories. Mr. Anderson, as well as a number of others, has been interviewed for a new documentary.
Right.
As have I and Irena, we're part of it. And when he'd been interviewed, he put a little post on Facebook saying, been interviewed. And there was a lady in one of the comments with a totally different name. And don't ask me to tell you because I can't remember what her name is. But she said, oh, I saw that thing that night. Now, what we didn't know at the time that she and Mr. Anderson are actually cousins.
Oh, wow.
And neither of them knew about the other sighting. This lady, she said, I went to put the children to bed at whatever time, you know, 8:30, 9 o'clock. And I'm going to close the bedroom curtains, which looks out across towards the river. And hey, presto, there's this blue thing flying around.
Right.
You know? So that just, you know, again, those that criticize witness testimony because they've stepped forward or whatever. This lady didn't step forward. She made a little comment, you know.
Right.
And again, had I not seen it and passed it on to Irena, then we would have never have known about it. And I'll give you another example. Calvin was doing a book signing in Pascagoula one day. I don't know if it's 2018 or 2019. And a gentleman came up, can I have a book, Mr. Parker? Yeah, sign it. And as he's walking away, he just, a little comment to it. He said, I saw that UFO that night. And he walked away. Luckily, somebody had been taking photographs, and we have a picture of him buying the book from Calvin. So eventually I put that on social media. Somebody knew him.
Wow.
Asked if they could pass on his details to us, which they did. And his name was Mr. Lewis Lee. Sadly, Mr. Lee passed away earlier this year.
Oh.
But we interviewed him, and now, again, he was on the other side of the river that night working in the shipyard. He was a crane driver. And he said, Philip, my cab on the crane is about 10 feet or so off the ground. This is as soon as I got in my cab, I could see this thing out across the river. He said, I've never, ever seen anything like it in my life. And he watched it for a few minutes. The only reason he took his eyes off it is because his colleague down below was shouting at him because got
a job to do.
Yeah. And he said, when I look back, it had gone. So I just automatically said, did you tell anyone about it? And he says, Philip, this is 1973. These were his words. He says, there's no Ghostbusters to call. You know?
True.
He says, I just told my family about it. So he hadn't kept it secret. He just told his family.
Right.
And then, you know, one way or another, other witnesses were located. I'll pass this to Irena in just 1 second.
Yes.
We knew that in 1973, via a newspaper cutting, that a local clergyman, a pastor called Emmanuel Sigalis, and a gentleman from the police and probation service called Raymond Broadhurst had also seen something that night. They were driving out the town when they saw this thing come right across the front of them, heading again in the general direction of where Charlie and Calvin were. And in this newspaper article, it said that there was a young lady in the back of the car, but no name. Now, Mr. Broadhurst and Pastor Sigalis have passed away. However, a gentleman from Greece, no less, called Stephanos Panagiotakis contacted us. And in 1981, he was in the Greek Merchant Navy. He was a radio operator. And the ship that he was on docked in Pascagoula.
Oh, come on.
Yeah.
That's just so far out there.
Yeah.
Wow.
And he was a UFO researcher.
Of course. Wow.
So he set off to find Charles Hickson, which he did.
Right.
Went to his house, had an interview with them.
Okay.
And he went to the police station and they said, you should interview Pastor Sigalis. He's of Greek origin as well. So they gave him his address. He went to the pastor's house, unannounced, knocked on the door. Hey, presto, he's there. So Stephanos got an interview with the pastor, which we have. We have a transcript of it. And we also found the lady's name. And her name she was in the back of the car, was called Joanne Hallmark. What they were doing that night is that the pastor and the guy from the probation service and Miss Hallmark were going to a church-sponsored meeting for people who had problems with alcohol. And she was a volunteer in the church. She was actually the first to see it because she's looking out of the side window. She thought this was something, like a religious event almost. It was so bizarre to her.
Right.
And she alerted the gentleman in front of the car, and hey presto, a colleague helped us find an old photograph of Miss Hallmark from around that time. And we found a little bit of information. She wasn't a resident of Pascagoula. She'd lived there for a short time. I think she taught for a year at one of the local schools. Anyway, I found some social media accounts for her that hadn't been used for an awful long time. I left messages and got nowhere. So eventually I had another look at them a long time later, and there was a name of a church associated with one of them. So I thought, well, I'll have a go. Put this church into Google. Hey presto, there was such a church. And it wasn't in Mississippi, it was in Maryland. And the church had a website. And on this website were some sermons by two gentlemen who had the surname Hallmark. Now I'm thinking, could that be her husband or sons or,
Right.
Now the church had a very general email address, info@church, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So I emailed them and said, I'm looking to speak to this lady. I gave her my full name. And all I said was she was in Pascagoula in 1973 and she worked with Pastor Emmanuel Sigalis. If she's around, could you pass my email on to her, please? About a month later, I got a reply from her. She confirmed, yes, in 1973, she worked with the pastor and so on. Then I had to, ask the question.
Throw it out there.
And I told her who we were and what we were doing. And again, it took her a number of weeks, but she came back and she said, yep, that's me. I saw that thing, and she described it. And then, can we, have your telephone number? And Irena, we'll I don't know if you remember her, Irena, Joanne Hallmark.
Yeah, I remember her.
Yeah, well, Irena will tell you what she said.
Yeah, Sherlock Holmes couldn't do the job that Philip does. He's just
Right.
amazing at finding people. But I called her, and at first she was just a little bit reluctant to talk. And the reason why was because she was a young woman back then, and she was in a car with two men. And so she was kind of nervous about saying that. But, she was the church pianist. And, it was just a perfectly businesslike thing. And so she remembered it real well. She remembered every detail, which was pretty surprising, after that long. But she said she had seen it. She didn't know what it was. She told them, I don't remember exactly, I think she's a cylinder or something, but she described talking to them about it, and none of them could figure out what it was. It was that same night.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, what Stephanos did back in 1981, he got in the car with the pastor to drive the route. And at the point where he said, this is where we were when we saw it, Stephanos took a photograph just out of the car window, and then he had it developed. I got the pastor to draw the UFO on the photograph. And I have to tell you, it is a thing not dissimilar to what Charlie and Calvin, you've got this drawing of this thing with two lights on one end, which is what they described. And it went right across the road in front of them.
Right.
And another thing, we mentioned that they phoned the local authorities. We've been in contact with the police dispatcher who was on duty that night. He took the call from Charles Hickson. But he also went on to say it took over 50 other calls of UFOs that night.
50?
Over 50.
That's a lot of sense.
And he said,
wow.
when he was back in the police station, there were people there reporting it in person. And he said one of them was a clergyman. Now, I've often wondered if that clergyman wasn't Pastor Sigalis.
Well, how many clergymen do you think would have cited it that same night?
Exactly. And the police dispatcher said, I wrote all of this in the logbook for the night and handed it in. But sadly, the police department were also the victims of Hurricane Katrina. I think they lost half the building. So paper files and what you have gone. But there's no reason to disbelieve the gentleman. And in fact, the sheriff was interviewed several times, and we only recently found out that 2 days later the sheriff had his own UFO sighting. But he said the county, I don't know what that means, but they'd had thousands of phone calls about it, literally.
Yeah. But it's interesting that the sheriff himself don't talk to anybody about that.
Yeah.
Who has his own experience.
Yeah, absolutely.
I like
absolutely. That. And we have an audio recording of Sheriff Fred Diamond recorded the day after. So this is the 12th of October. A local journalist has caught up with him looking for Charlie and Calvin. And he says, they're not here. They're at the hospital. So while they're at the hospital, the journalist is probably thinking, well, I've got to get a story from somebody. So he interviews Fred Diamond, the sheriff. Right. And it's a very telling interview. And he basically says these guys were telling the truth. Same with Dr. Hynek. He had a press conference before he left and said, you should treat these gentlemen with dignity and not ridicule. And something happened to these men, period. Right. And it is alleged that this became Hynek's favorite case down the years. And one of his sons, Paul Hynek, is on friendly terms with Calvin Parker. Calvin would ring Dr. Hynek, and it would be a young Paul Hynek at the time would answer the telephone. And apparently they had a blackboard next to the telephone, and he'd write messages on there for his father. Right. Calvin would say, don't tell me he's not in, go and get him,
Yeah, right. Yeah. I love that. There seems to be, obviously a lot of people saw the craft, and aside from Mary and her husband who were abducted, were any other abductions actually reported?
there was one lady, and again, I can't remember her name off the top of my head because we have spoken to so many.
Yes.
There was potentially a period of missing time in the sightings she recounted. And we talked about this, and she just said, you know, it is what it is, and that's it. She didn't want to explore it any further. So, you know, we abide by her wishes and leave it at that. But what we did find, and it's like the sonic boom that Irena had investigated, was that across the United States in 1973 was a huge wave of sightings. And it would seem that maybe the Pascagoula was the epicenter of it. You know, that was the peak. And there is even a self-written book called 1973, The Year of the Humanoids. And my colleague Kevin Randall some years ago wrote a book and called it The October Scenario. And he's doing an update of that, which I'll be publishing next month, simply called 1973, the year of UFOs, abductions, and so on.
No, I love that.
This wasn't a one-off isolated incident. There were things happening all around the area, literally. It's difficult for me being in England because we are such a small place. You know, if I say in England something's 200 miles away, that's a long way to us, you know.
Yes.
But in the United States, 200 miles is just a little drive.
That's true. You're not wrong.
You know,
right. Yes.
I had relatives in Canada that used to drive 200 miles to their favorite burger bar, you know. So
I'm one of those guys in Canada.
Yeah. So,
Right.
so people tend to dismiss things that didn't necessarily happen bang on that date. Well, we haven't.
Right.
What we've done, we've recorded and some sightings that happened just before, some that happened just after, some that were a little bit, you know, further away, but in the same sort of general, what I would call for American general area. Again, another gentleman that Irena got to interview on, I think it's November. I might be wrong with the date, but I think it was November the 4th, 1973. So we're talking a few weeks later. In the same area of the river, but just a bit further out where it gets deeper, there were 3 skiffs, 3 little boats. I think that in total had 8 people on them, fishing. And they weren't using rods, or they had nets. And they saw this thing under the water, and it lit up. It was circular. They estimate about 30 feet in diameter, and it was split in segments. They likened it to one of the old-fashioned parachutes. When you look it from above, it had segments in it.
Right.
And they got up to it, and they hit it with their oar, and it went clunk. And the lights went out, and it would move somewhere else, and it would be illuminated again. And they played cat and mouse with it for 30 or 40 minutes.
That's amazing.
So they went and reported it in person to the Coast Guard. They had a Coast Guard station there. The Coast Guard sent a boat out, and they saw it. And they hit it with an oar, and it still went clunk. And the same cat and mouse thing happened. It was reported to the US Navy. I think it was the next day. Somebody from the Navy came out and spoke to one of the witnesses and said, this witness thought this Navy guy's nuts, you know. Can you show me where it was? Well, it's just the water. There's nothing to see, you know. I can't show you anything, you know.
Right.
And what we did have, of course, we managed to get the official Coast Guard documentation on this. And it is a full account of what happened. There's all the people named in it. And a colleague of mine said, I think so-and-so has got a photograph of all those witnesses. It's what the Coast Guard did the next day, was line them up on the quayside, take a color photograph of them. And then on the back, he wrote their names and their age, so we know who everybody was. And I got a copy of this photograph. And again, I put it on social media. Within no time at all, a lady has contacted me and said, I think all these people are now deceased apart from one. And I think it was either her or a friend's father-in-law. And he was one of the witnesses. We got his phone number. I think was it Earl Ryan, Irena? Mr. Earl Ryan, who was only a young fella at the time, passed it on to Irena, and she spoke to him. Tell Michelle what Mr. Ryan said, Irena.
Well, he's the only one that's still alive, but it had 16 witnesses, which is a whole lot, including 2 Coast Guard officers. But he said he was out with his father, and they saw this thing down under the water, and he thought it was illuminated from underneath. But when they hit it and things, it would go someplace else and turn its lights off, and then it'd appear someplace else. There were some other people, like his I think his father's twin or something, and some other people were in boats and they saw it. So anyway, he and his father went and got the Coast Guard. 2 officers came out, and they interacted with it too, such as hitting it and bothering it, and it would go one place and then it'd light up and go someplace else. And the Coast Guard man said it was a very strange light, because he said if you put an oar out over it, that the light would go right through and not have a shadow, like it was an X-ray or something. And so it wasn't quite a normal light, and he'd said something about it too. There was something about somebody's boat stopped when it was in the vicinity, and I wasn't too sure whose boat it was. It wasn't their boat, though. And so they watched it and interacted with it for quite a while. And he said he thought it was guided and it knew where it was going, because he said there was in the riverbed, there was a deep trench that went down, and that this thing eventually knew where the deep trench was and went down through there. But nobody could figure out what it was. And the Coast Guard and the Navy took this real seriously, even though it happened the same time, just about the same, November 6th, a few weeks later after the Pascagoula abduction. And I think he said it was about a mile from where it was. And people ridiculed, Calvin and Charlie, but the Navy took this pretty seriously. And for one thing, the shipyard had nuclear facilities that the government was hiding from people then, and they were interested in that there was a sighting close to there. And so it was seriously investigated, and some of the newspapers harassed him, told him, that he was seeing a fish swimming around with a light or something, but, otherwise they were taking it seriously.
Yeah, I mean, what is mentioned in these Coast Guard documents as well, Michelle, that we've never been able to get a hold of, is that the witnesses were interviewed on tape, and we've not been able to find a copy of that tape, if it even exists, of course.
I've buried
deep. Yeah. Well, it could just be on a dusty shelf somewhere.
Also true.
All forgotten about.
Yes.
And I have written to the Coast Guard, I have written to the Navy, and they have no idea what I'm talking about. And I've sent copies of the documents that we have. We even have a letter, I think it's from a member of the Coast Guard crew, a handwritten letter describing what he saw that night, and a little drawing of it.
It sounds a lot like they're just trying to literally put it aside, and they don't want to.
Well, of course,
either found something, and maybe they don't want to pursue it.
Yeah, I mean, of course, today there's a lot of emphasis on things that are seen either on or just under the water surface, with the Tic Tac sightings and so on.
Yes.
So this, predates it by a long time. And people say, well, it had nothing to do with the Pascagoula incident. It's 3 weeks later. Well, I said, well, look, what we've done throughout the book, we present the information that we've accumulated, and we allow you to decide, make up your own mind whether it's connected or not, whether it's relevant or not, whether the sonic boom is connected or not, whether other people's sightings in different areas are relevant or not. But it's absolutely fascinating. And and things continue to happen, Michelle. You know,
Mhm.
at the time, so going back a couple of years now, there were so many people. My wife said to me, "You're like a man on a mission," you know, because no disrespect to anyone, I've been seriously ill. Irena's had her share of illness, and people who were witness to these events are now of a certain age, you know, that perhaps will only get this one opportunity to speak to them.
I was going to say it's now or never, because this is a lot of work that you guys have done.
Yeah. So, for example, a doctor who examined Charlie and Calvin, called Dr. Bosco, if I remember correctly,
Yeah.
we managed to find him. And he was 90 or 90 plus. Irena spoke to him. His mind was a little bit vague in points, but we have a vintage TV interview with him anyway. We've used that interview in the book. But Irena interviewed him, and God bless him, he has since passed away. Now, had we not bothered, I thought,
right.
we'll go back later. That would have been gone. Same with I think he became Captain Glenn Ryder. He was the deputy involved that night. He'd spoken several times, but again, sadly, he passed away this year. And also, I remember Calvin a couple of years back. I think it was in a local store, and a chap approached him and said, "You know, Mr. Parker, I saw something that night." And Calvin vaguely knew this chap, you know. So, and it was on the run into Christmas. And Calvin says, "I'll tell you what, when Christmas is out of the way, we'll have a talk about it." And of course, over Christmas, this gentleman sadly, you know, lost his life. So it was so we were on a mission, if you like, because of the circumstances between ourselves and the age group that we're probably dealing with.
Yes.
One of the things that's not in the book, because it came in literally, I would say a week, 10 days ago. And we'll be hearing more about it, hopefully, when I get the time. A lady by the name of Chelsea Norton Price, who runs the Ocean Springs Historical Society in Mississippi. She had one of their members called Bethany Fayard. I think I've got that correct. I apologize if I haven't. Contact her and say, because Chelsea had put a post in saying, you know, I'm interested in the Pascagoula case. And she said, I've got 2 boxes full of stuff in my garage that used to belong to Charles Hickson. Basically, Bethany's mum and dad, they bought Charlie Hickson's house when he died, and everything in the house was left. You know, it wasn't empty. It was, they had a box full of papers.
That's unbelievable.
And unfortunately for us, some of these were given away a few years back by, I think, Bethany's ex-husband. But she got 2 big plastic boxes full of this stuff. And of course, Chelsea, thankfully, contacted me. And she said, I'll digitize them all for you, Philip. And she did an amazing job. I don't know how she digitized. She's done them that quickly. I still haven't gone through them all.
Wow, that's
most
fantastic.
of them, most of them are chit chat. You know, can I buy your book, Mr. Hickson? I saw you on TV, Mr. Hickson. You know, and so on. But there's some little gems in it, Michelle. And I've sent some of these to Irena. What Irena have been working on at the moment. Everything that I've got now is pretty much digitized. So it's all going to go on a hard drive and sent to Irena. If I tried to send it on email, it'd take forever. You know, it's the only way.
Gosh, yes.
Yeah, it's just, we've got too much. But in this pile of letters, there is a handwritten list by Charlie Hickson. I think it's numbered 1 to 20. It's almost like we do bullet points now.
Yes.
And it describes the creatures one bit at a time. You know, their nose, this protrusion that came out the front was so long. Their chest was so big. You know, There you go.
Wow.
Irena has a copy of it printed out there. And not only that, both gentlemen, when they had this encounter, they were mesmerized by a lot of things, but they were both engineers, builders, guys used to working with their hands and making stuff.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that they really focused on was this opening that appeared on this UFO.
Mm-hmm.
They could not, to them, it was, how did that happen? So what you have in this batch of papers is also some hand drawings by Charlie Hickson of this opening.
Wow.
And it looks like nothing, but then further on another page is a hand drawing of the UFO itself by Charlie,
Right.
which nobody has ever seen before,
Mm-hmm.
And for me, it's a little piece of UFO history in that
Exactly.
respect. It's a historical document. So there's that many. I mean, Chelsea said, "Do you want me to digitize the envelopes that came in?" And I said, "Yeah, digitize everything."
Yes.
And so she's put it all on a thumb drive, and it's going to arrive any day. But I've got a batch of them,
Mm-hmm.
and there's letters in there from Betty Hill. And Betty's describing some other sightings that she had, and there's other sort of well-known people writing to him, but there's others,
Mm-hmm.
complete strangers,
Mm-hmm.
writing and telling Charlie about what had happened to them.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I've got about maybe a third of the way through them. So I'll wait while the thumb drive arrives. It'd probably be easy to view them that way.
It makes sense that they would reach out to him, because it's like
absolutely.
you would understand.
Absolutely.
Therefore, here's my story. A curiosity. These look like real particularly like you have not heard of these description of these type of beings before. This seems to be really isolated to Pascagoula. Have you gotten anything out of like even in the field, both of you? Like
no, there's nothing like these anywhere. Somebody asked me this just the other day, and I said no. I mean, and we're both, Irena and I, are well read on the subject.
Yes,
know lots of colleagues. We've expanded the case with drawings and pictures and so on, and nobody's come forward and said, look at this one in this book. We even found out in this batch of documents that in 1988 in Gaucher in Mississippi, there was a one-day UFO conference featuring Bud Hopkins and Charles Hickson. Now, nobody in his dog knew anything about that. We found a few newspaper cuttings about it, but it's not mentioned anywhere. It's not significant, groundbreaking, smoking gun revelations. It's just part of the overall story. Because what we don't go into in detail in the book is the fact that Charlie and Calvin both went under hypnosis with Bud Hopkins. And we have the tapes of that, of copies of them. Calvin in 1993 went under hypnosis with Bud Hopkins. Charlie in 1985 and 1989. So they knew each other. And we have, like I say, the copies of the tapes of these sessions. And they are fascinating in their own right. They really are. But they also deal with other things that they may or may have not encountered. So we've stuck with the 1973 incident in this particular book. What else these documents might throw up, who knows? But it's like we were hunting for the tape from the Coast Guard. Maybe it is lying in somebody's filing cabinet somewhere, and nobody knows what it is.
Well, maybe with all this disclosure that's starting, in the United States, maybe it'll surface now.
Yeah, I mean, for example, all the witnesses, as far as I'm aware, to the Roswell incident are now deceased.
Yes.
So I've said on a few occasions, what you may be looking for now is things that are left in somebody's basement or in their attic or their garage. And hey, presto, we get 2 boxes, of Charlie Hickson's letters. And what's interesting, I saw a little news interview with with Charlie, and I did a screen grab. And he's interviewed in his bedroom, and he sat at the dressing table. But on his bed is all these letters laid out. Maybe some of those letters on his bed are what's in those two plastic boxes. You know,
I wouldn't be the least bit surprised. It seems like he kept everything together.
If you think about Whitley Strieber, when Communion came out, he was inundated with letters. This was
That's
a
right.
smaller scale than that, but
Yes.
nonetheless, you know, not dissimilar.
Right.
And things are happening all the time, Michelle. So we never know what's next.
Hmm. I agree. I think people reach out when they see somebody who they figure can understand. It's not easy coming forward with stories like that. It's easier for people to believe in ghosts and those type of beings than it is for people to want to acknowledge something from the stars or maybe that's here already. What I find interesting is when Mary had said like they had taken eggs and they're obviously interested in hybridization, but yet you don't hear about these beings. So it makes you wonder how successful they are. Or, you know, is it really that they're just doing a good job at scrubbing, you know, the memory, and people just haven't wanted to talk about it or just simply can't recall it?
Yeah, I think a combination of such things in reality.
Mhm.
But so what Irena and I have done in this book is we've put all the information that we've accumulated from all the different sources.
Mhm.
It's littered with documents and newspapers and correspondence and photographs. So by doing that, we've tried to bring it alive as well, so we to help visualize what was happening. And we are confident, hence the title of the book, if we took this evidence to court, that we could prove beyond reasonable doubt that something truly extraordinary took place that night. We would never be able to prove they were abducted by aliens or anything else, but something really bizarre did happen. And that's our argument. And we say, you know, either agree or disagree, you know, that's the way it is. And for example, you know, Calvin's been under hypnosis several times. And I said, is the hypnosis of any use to you, Calvin? He says, not really. I can remember everything anyway. I don't need it. He says it's clarified one or 2 points. And with the same hypnotherapist that we used with Mrs. Blair, we used on Calvin again last year. Not because we were looking for any more information, simply because we had the opportunity to do it and record it. So we have these on audio and video. So we have a video recording of it. And despite what he tells you about the abduction, one thing that struck me is this time I asked the hypnotherapist to ask Calvin a couple of questions. She'd already interviewed Maria Blair, so she knew the subject matter. And I said, when Calvin, before anything happens, when Calvin stood on that pier with his fishing rod, you know, in the water, and he's just watching the world go by, just ask him to describe what he sees, the scene before him. So he does, and he said, yeah, there's a boat going out. So I often wondered how those big heavy metal boats float, you know. There's the bridge. And then right at the end, he says, oh, there's 2 figures on the opposite side of the river. Now, I asked the question, were those 2 figures Mr. and Mrs. Blair? Unlikely, I know, but unless you ask the question, you won't find an answer. So I've left that, you know, open.
Right.
But so the case continues to expand, Michelle. This is what I'm saying.
Yes.
Little things, documents and drawings found in somebody's garage. Dr. Scott and I have taken part in a documentary with a British production company that should be out by the end of the year. They were over in America interviewing Calvin and Calvin. They've got Eddie Hickson. They interviewed Eddie, which we did for our book. Eddie wasn't there at the time, but what we did, we interviewed Eddie and Waynette Parker, Calvin's wife, because they could tell us how this affected their their respective husband and father.
Yes. Yes.
Eddie said his mother was more upset because she lived in the fear that these things would come back, and she was forever looking over her shoulder.
Yeah, I could see that.
Yeah, Calvin was traumatized with it and lived with that trauma for years. He was like a wandering minstrel, trying to get out of the way, and that affected him badly. So who knows what's going to happen next? What may I mean? I was contacted literally today. There is a charity, that's the word I'm looking for, called Main Street Pascagoula in the town, and they raise money for certain things, and they put on activities and things. They want to do something for the 50th anniversary.
Oh, very nice.
And they say, would Calvin make an appearance? But sadly, Calvin can't do that. So I've put a few suggestions to them. And of course, it was this particular charity that back in, I think it was 2018 or 2019, raised enough money to have a historical marker made and put at the site. And it's there. It was officially unveiled by the mayor. And Calvin's interviewed next to it, crying, literally crying. Yeah, so we have a photo of Calvin, and Eddie Hickson came. So what I've suggested to the charity today is that, look, there's all these witnesses in and around the area. If you're putting on some kind of event, or I don't know, it could. If you let me have the details, I'll pass it on to them. They may contact you and turn up, even though Calvin can't do it in person. But it's like I say, it's a fascinating case that continues to grow. It really does.
It does. It almost sounds like you should put together a book of just some of these copies of these letters once you have used them for your own research and you've put them where you need to put them. It might be interesting to let people see things like this. I think the level of research that you guys have done on this has essentially brought it to the forefront, because realistically, like, you just get little bits and pieces. People do research. Most people will only go with what they find online, and whatever's online has been put there by someone. It's really difficult unless you I cross-reference things to death. And even then, I'm just like, there still has to be more. Some of us are really, we just really pick away and pick away and pick away. Whereas some people just go and just one or two articles and they miss so much.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, like I said, when we set off on this quest, the Pascagoula case was dead and buried. Yes. Simply because there was nobody out there championing it. Charlie Hickson had died. Calvin was living nearby, but didn't want to speak about it. And it was just by chance that a lot of these things have happened. And we're hoping, and there's no guarantee, we're hoping that the documentary we've been making may again entice other information. Irena herself has been speaking to Charlie Hickson's grandson, I believe it was. Was it not, Irena?
Yeah, and he said he was going over things with his mother, and I just spoke to his mother briefly, and she's trying to figure out what they have. She wanted to go through it again.
Yeah, and also Eddie Hickson. I've spoken to Eddie. And he has, for example, a box of VHS videotapes that belong to his father, but he can't play them, so he has no idea what's on them. So
should I send him a VHS recorder? I'm that guy that's probably got about 3 of them in storage.
yeah. So we do know there's other things lying around, and we're confident because it happened in 1973. It's 50 years ago. But people lived till they're 70, 80, 90. So witnesses that were there at that time, there's no reason why they shouldn't still be, available now. I mean, I left high school the year after. I was 15 when this happened. Right. So, we are still on the lookout for other witnesses who can contact us in in confidence if required.
Mm-hmm.
To be honest, I think Irena will know better than me. Most of the people we've spoken to have said, no, you can use my name, no big deal, you know.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they're of an age now where they couldn't care less whether people believe them or not. Calvin's the same.
Different
He said,
times now.
yeah,
as
he
well.
said, Calvin said, I don't care if you don't believe me. You know, simple as that. I don't care.
I like it.
I'm telling the truth, and that's it.
Yes, yes, yes.
Well, a lot of them are retired, and so they don't have to worry about getting harassed on the job either.
That's another big one, you know, like I think back then you put out a story like this and you know, there's a lot of repercussions that come with it. I've watched many documentaries just because of the amount of shows that we do. And there was a story about a meteorologist in Michigan, and he had seen, you know, on radar that they were seeing like crafts coming in, and he tried to talk about that, and he lost his job eventually. Like you don't talk about that, and it wasn't really that long ago. Maybe a decade, you know, 15 years. It's not, we're not even talking like the 70s where there's like a family secret you just didn't talk about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, here in the UK, back in 1980, we had a police constable, Alan Godfrey, on duty in his patrol car, just finishing his night shift early morning when he encountered a UFO, had missing time, went under hypnosis. And he got permission from his boss, the chief constable, to talk about it in public. So his boss gave him permission to talk about it. Right. And when he did, all his colleagues did was ridicule him, and he lost his job.
Yeah, see?
But he'd got permission
by
his boss. You know, he couldn't go any higher to speak about it. And I think he was set up, you know, and they got rid of him as a result.
Right.
But you know, Calvin's nobody. He doesn't have a boss. He couldn't care less anymore. In fact, he wishes he'd told the story before he actually did. But you know, we can't change history. So all we would say as well, Michelle, anybody listening to this tonight, if they've got any information or you know, maybe a witness to these events, you know, please step forward. You know, in confidence if required.
Yeah, I will make sure that your email is out, and I will make sure that it gets included in the write-up for the show as well. And I will put a little blip in there that states looking for information, and you guys, and hopefully something will come of it. Again, it happened such a long time ago, but in the grand scheme of things, you know, it's still, you still have people and descendants, because I find that this is who you talk to. Like when I was having, you know, all my experiences with UFOs and extraterrestrials, you know, at first, I mean, I realize now that it's been happening since childhood, but when it came back to light as an adult, I'm like, you really do go into denial. And I'm pretty open-minded. I've experienced a lot of things, but the first people, you know, some of the first people I reach out to, of course, is my family. You know, have you had any experiences? Have you seen anything? And then it stays within the family. I was just told it's better for me to go public. So I did. Yeah. But there's many people who aren't in a position, they don't have platforms to do that. And they're not encouraged to do that.
Yeah. Well, it's like Irena with the sonic boom. What were you doing at the time of the sonic boom, Irena? Where were you, and how did you find out about it?
Well, I found out about it I was at the University of Missouri working on my PhD. And my mother was in Ohio, which was 600 miles away. And I got a phone call from her. And she said, "Did you hear that sound?" And, you know, I said, you know, nuts.
Oh, yeah.
Skeptic. And, you know, that was a strange thing for her to do. But a few days later, she called and said there was just a huge UFO wave. And from a skeptic, this is pretty interesting, because she said people were hiding in their house and they were keeping their kids in at night. Wow. And things like that. It was just like a war zone. And this was up in Ohio, which was not Missouri, but they were just having a massive UFO flap at the same time Pascagoula was going on up here. But nobody knew about it as much because the abduction took a lot of, you know, publicity. But there were things going on elsewhere too that were pretty amazing at the same time.
Right.
What is
Right.
interesting, Michelle, what we did, I read a newspaper article, and it was the chap, again, his name escapes me. I think it might have been Nixon, but he was the head of NICAP at the time, the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena. They were sort of the main UFO group at the time. And he said in this interview, as a result of the Parker and Hickson encounter, we've been inundated, literally. So a chap by the name of David Marler runs the National UFO Historical Records Center in Albuquerque. And they just happen to have all the NICAP files. I mean, literally, physically have them. So I contacted David and said, look, this gentleman said they were inundated after the Hickson Parker case. Can you just randomly select some of their case files from that autumn after that date? And can I use them, please? And he said, yeah. He sent me about 20, I think it was. So we have a chapter just on incidents from the NICAP files. And these were all in different parts of the US, but all after, and they're all reported as a result, just to give you some kind of example of what kind of impression this encounter made. So we have a whole chapter on that. And isn't it funny that Irena, the first indication she got of anything was that night, October the 11th, 1973. And here she is all these years later, publishing a book about it with that in. I mean, who would have guessed? Who would have ever guessed that?
Yeah, I got the phone call right then because my husband could hear that sound. Well, that made the newspapers all across the country too,
Right.
Along with the abduction, and may have added to the information.
Right.
And your conclusion on that sonic boom was what, Irena?
Nobody could explain it.
There you
go. I worked with several geologists and seismologists, and nobody could explain it. It was mysterious, but nobody paid attention to it because nobody saw anything. If they'd have seen something, it would probably really make the news.
And nothing before that ever? Like
Huh?
You've not, like there was no experiences like that before this night? Or, I mean, I guess I should expand it to both of you guys on both counts, on Irena's sonic boom and on the story itself. Were there any experiences that led up to this night that would have given insight into what was coming?
Not at the time. In hindsight, possibly. Yeah,
Right.
because we learned that it was a huge wave of sightings, did we not, Irena? Yeah.
Well, there was a professor in Missouri that heard about UFOs in that area, and he set up a study area, just like a scientific experiment with observation stations and everything in early 1973. He recorded a number of sightings, and they did it in a real scientific way. He published it. Harley Rutledge, Professor Harley Rutledge, he was a head of the department. And the sightings slowly built up until about October, and then there was just a crash of sightings, and then they went down. And so there was just a whole lot there. And I mean, he did a real scientific study. And so, this was Missouri, but it seemed to be happening all over the country or the world.
That's why, Michelle, we've used things that happened just before and just after.
Right.
Because people will argue, oh, there's no connection to them, but there was this huge wave, and this was, in our opinion, part of that. Whatever that was, this was part of it. And so probably not at the time, I mean, these things just seemed to be a one-off.
Right.
But they weren't. I mean, we didn't have digital communication like we have now.
That's true.
Can
you imagine if you did?
Yeah, you would only read your local newspaper or maybe one of the nationals. But what happened in the next county, you would have no idea what. I mean, nothing. I mean, I had a UFO sighting in 1984, and I met up with a chap, and we became friends 10 years later. And lo and behold, he'd seen the same thing as I, and we are still friends to this very day.
Right.
But none of us had any knowledge of this. Like, we've been very fortunate because we have used social media to our benefit. Like when we tried to track down Earl Ryan, who saw the thing under the water. When we posted the photograph of Mr. Ryan and the others that were involved, literally within hours, we have a lady contacting and say, I know where this fella is. The rest are deceased. And we've done that time and time again, like Miss Louise Lee. In fact, it was a lady at the local library said, I know who that is, but I've got to ask permission to pass his details on, which is entirely correct.
Yes.
But had Irena been doing this back in 1973, for example, there is no way on earth that we could have accumulated all of this material using the technology of the day. It would just have been impossible. And like I said, the information continues to grow, and I'm sure it's going to grow for some time to come. And hopefully Irena and I are here on the receiving end.
Right.
In fact,
live too.
Well, that would be nice.
Alive is good. Alive is good. So basically, the story is going to continue. You already see that happening. And I think as the book makes its way out and you guys make your way through the airwaves, people will continue to reach out, because if you're having all of these experiences throughout the country, it shows that it wasn't just in Pascagoula. I think that was just maybe the catalyst.
Yeah,
to give a push.
Again, the good thing about today's technology that you pretty much obtain a copy of the book from anywhere in the world.
Yes.
I remember, for example, when Communion came out. I had to go into the city to the only big bookshop in the city to get a copy. And when I asked, they couldn't find it because they'd put it in the religious section.
That's interesting. But yes, Communion, of course.
So we are well aware of the financial constraints of a lot of people at the moment around the world. So what we have done on purpose, we have the hardback book, which is a large format and is the most expensive. We then have a softback edition, which is 10 by 8 inches, a little less expensive. Then there is a softback 9 by 6 inches, even cheaper. It's all exactly the same information in all three of them. Right. Then we have it on a Kindle, which you can download for even less. And then there is an audio book. I was contacted a few years back by a chap said, I'm a long distance lorry driver, Philip. Have you thought about doing audiobooks? He says, because as I'm driving, I have an audiobook playing. So we've
something for everyone.
Yeah. And so we are conscious of the financial constraints on some people. So we're hoping that there's something there for everyone's pocket. And you can get it from just about anywhere in the world. Not everywhere, but most.
Right.
And of course, the documentary is following. So our book has more information in it than the documentary, simply because of the volume of people we've interviewed.
Right.
I think the documentary may have interviewed about 14 people. So you will then, when that comes out, I dare say it'll eventually end up on the various platforms. You will be able to not only read about these people, but you'll be able to see them and hear it for yourself. And again, I think the way they're doing the documentary, which we have no control over,
of course,
is a bit like a whodunit, a bit like a whodunit. These things happened. Who was responsible? So I'm anxious to see how it turns out. So that'll be another option for people as well. And they can draw their own conclusions.
I'm completely fascinated just by the fact that these beings have never, nobody talks about them. They're interested in possible hybridization, but nobody talks about them. You hear about the Greys, you hear about the reptilians, you hear about tall whites, you hear about all of these typical type of races, but this is completely, it's just an anomaly.
Well, not only that, if we look at the so-called disclosure lobby,
Yes.
and we've seen David Grush give his testimony and so on, what you will notice from all of these is there is no mention of abductions. I mean, none. David Grush went on the record, and I firmly believe Mr. Rush believes what he's saying.
Yeah.
And he talked about people being murdered to keep these secrets.
Yes.
But yet there's not a mention of abductions anywhere.
Why do you think that is?
Well, you also had Leslie Keane, who's involved in a lot of this. And I know Leslie has a copy of our book, by the way. I know she has because I sent it. She has confirmed she's got it. But again, when she was writing about the claims made by Mr. Grush, she purposely left out certain things because,
fear, do you think?
Not fear. They're trying to in her estimation, add an air of credibility to the subject.
Right.
And to have certain things associated with it. We have to remember this phenomenon was called flying saucers.
Yes.
It was the United States Air Force who came up with the acronym UFO.
Right.
And they came up with that acronym to give it an air of credibility.
Yes.
And they've now changed the acronym because that acronym has become synonymous with alien spaceships.
That's right.
Now it's called UAP. It's the same thing, different name. And they've used that terminology to try and give it an air of credibility.
Right.
But you can't give it an air of credibility when you're trying to edit out parts of the phenomena that you don't like.
That's a big one. I mean, I understand in a way it's easier for people to look at something in the sky and go, oh, okay, our government's on it. You've got those God-fearing people. You've got media always instilling fear. So they're thinking, okay, I can see that. I'm okay. It's different, I think, for people to digest when there's the whole air behind everything of abduction. I'll always go, I'd rather call myself an experiencer or contactee. It's easier to take than abductee. My experiences, I don't have a lot of recollections, but I do have some recollections where they're pleasant.
Yeah.
So I don't know, but it's easier to swallow, I think.
Yeah, exactly. But why would you want to whitewash that part out of the phenomena? You can't, can you?
I agree with you. Yes.
You can't cherry pick what you think is palatable for Joe Public.
It's all or nothing. Do you think maybe it's because, and I'm going to put that out there, but do you think because there's a lot of, let's say, my lab involved and they just want to make that whole abduction thing go away? Maybe.
Who knows?
Yeah.
The answer is we don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, I've asked Calvin this many times. What the hell happened, Calvin? Come on, you were there.
Yeah.
He says, Philip, I've thought about this. I've thought about that. And I just don't know. He said, I thought it might be demons. It's all I know. I was not in control, and I saw these things again in 1993.
Wow.
And I just wanted to kill them. I'd had enough, and that's what he attempted to do. But who knows? But David Rush made some very startling comments. But what about nobody asked the question? This was what annoys me. Mr. Grush, were you given any information about the abduction phenomena? And if he says no, well then fair enough, but why is nobody asking the question? And as what we're saying is, you don't have to wait for the government or any government to give you the answers. The answers are staring you in the face, and we believe that some of those answers may well be in our new book, So have a look and see if you agree or not. It is that simple. And if people think this is just a commercial venture, They
Yeah.
have no idea how many hours that Irena and myself and others have spent on this, you
Mhm.
know, and some finance as well. It's not a
Yes.
commercial
Oh,
venture.
it doesn't. Yeah, it doesn't. It's not free.
No,
Research is expensive.
yeah. So there
Yeah.
you go. Maybe some of the answers, and this may sound big-headed. I don't know. Again, I'll ask Irena if she agrees or not. Maybe some of the answers are there in that book staring you in the face. You just know where to look.
I would agree.
Would you agree, Irena?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it takes a credible, I would say the credible read, that the book, where it is so well researched that you can look and find this information, because it can be cross-referenced, and it's not just, there's a lot of fairy tales out there, and I don't mean to make it disrespectful by any means. I think a lot of people just run off, other people's research, trying to find those answers, but you don't know where to look. It's not just to be difficult. And I'm just going to throw a book out there. It's not easy to find. Like, I think you guys were meant to do this because of everything they're coming to you. The information is being sent to you. People are reaching out. Hey, I know this person. Yeah, you find a couple in chat, but it's amazing to me how the information finds a way to you one way or another. You may not have been in that chat room on a specific day. You happen to be on there on the right day. You happen to be, to be watching it. Like, I believe a lot in synchronicities, not so much in coincidence. So I believe when something is meant to be, it will find a way.
It certainly has done that with myself and Irena. And Irena and I were on a TV show on Sunday night, and it's now been posted on YouTube. So I have, on purpose, gone through all the comments on it.
Yeah.
Because, of course, what set us on this quest was a comment left on YouTube by Mr. and Mrs. Blair's daughter. So
Yes.
I've learned my lessons in that respect.
Right.
And yes, things come our way, but we've also learned different ways of looking for material as well, and looking for information, looking for other witnesses. And we've been successful, not always, but
Right.
I think 9 out of 10 times, Irena, when we've tried to contact somebody, we've managed to do so, and they've given us a statement, either on email or most of the time on the telephone. What we're preparing as well, and again, this is just within the last couple of days, we're looking at doing a follow-up, not a book, but maybe some articles about the things that come our way as a result of the book and maybe the TV show, documentary, that are not directly linked to Pascagoula. For example, Dr. Scott's interviewed somebody just the other day about another sighting, and it is a fascinating sighting. I've read it, so we've put that in a file. And that will, and some of these documents that I talked about from Ocean Springs Historical Society, we may put some of them in it as well.
I think that's fantastic.
Yeah. So, but these have all come about as a result of us doing this work, speaking to lovely people such as yourself, and whatever else comes our way.
I like it. I like it a lot. It can only go up from here, as I say. So how can people get a hold of you guys if they do have information or any information to share with you? And I'll put it out there. Philip and Irena are looking for any other witnesses or anybody who's got a story to tell in respects to Pascagoula alien abduction. I'll say that. Otherwise, you're going to get all kinds of like county stuff. So how can they get a hold of you?
Yeah, I mean, if you just type in Flying Disc Press on Google, Disc with a K, they'll find me. And there's a link on the blog. Just contact me. I'm on Facebook. I'm very visible. And if you kindly put my email address on this, just contact us, but with the greatest of pleasure, and we'll get back to them as soon as we can.
Fantastic. So we know we've got things coming up. We know how to get a hold of you. Is there anything else that you'd like to put out there before we end the show?
Well, again, just I've only been involved partially, but just when I met Calvin Parker, he was ill then, and he wanted to leave a legacy. He wanted to tell his story so that it was here for people in the future.
Right.
And we've tried to bring it to as many different audiences as we can. And literally just the last couple of days, there has been a graphic novel released by a company called Moonstone Books. And it's called UFO, The Closest Encounter.
Mm-hmm.
It's written by Martin Powell and illustrated by Jason Gleaves. Calvin writes a foreword for it and I write a small piece for it.
Mm-hmm.
But it's another audience, if you like, and it is based purely on the 1973 incident in Pascagoula. And what we will do, Michelle, when we have details of the documentary, when it's coming out, where it will be broadcast, we will pass that on to you so you can let your listeners know about it.
Absolutely, we will.
But thank you very much.
Oh, thank you guys so much for joining me today. And I'm looking forward to seeing what comes of all of this, because it's been very intriguing. I've been very interested, especially after talking to Irena the first time and knowing this book was coming. And I think it was just so well researched, even by the guys in the first place, just with the images. And I think oral history is very important. I think you need to talk about it. Otherwise, you get so many details that just get lost and people pass. And, I've always found it fascinating, even with, World War II, especially pilots. The deathbed confessions seem to really give a lot of information. And I'm glad this didn't turn into necessarily a deathbed confession. I'm glad that you guys have had a lot of time and continue to want to expand on it. So thank you for that and all the time that you put into it.
And I know I'm going to make a blush, but I couldn't have done it without Irena. I really couldn't. I think we make a good partnership, and I feel very privileged to work with a bona fide scientist. I'm the son of a
yes, she is.
I'm the son of a coal miner with no academic qualifications whatsoever. So I'm going to embarrass you now, Mrs. Scott.
Well, I have Sherlock Holmes, the greatest, I'm working with, and he's famous and everything else. So I'm thrilled to death.
Well, I'm thrilled to have you both. And in saying that, I'm going to close off the show. So thank you both to Irena and Philip for joining me today on The Outer Realm. Thank you to Folgers Coffee, who sponsor the show tonight and every night. Thank you to Justice Snicker, a.k.a. Dr. Snick, the Sonic Surgeon, for his voice and his music. Big thank you to Steve McGinnis for his artwork. We appreciate you all so very much. And guys, tune in and watch the segment. You will love it. Of course, Amelia and I will be in the chat room that night. And for next week, please look for a Q&A with Amelia and I. And on the Thursday night, look for Elliot Van Dusen and Daryl Walsh from the Halifax Paranormal Symposium, picking up where they left off last time they were on the show, and a little bit of parapsychology and a little bit of debate going on. So it's going to be a whole heap load of fun. Until then, everyone have a great weekend, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.